Awesome. So we're going to start with our technical interviews and how to ace your next technical interview. So why are we doing this workshop? Well, the truth is that recruiting is hard enough as it is without it all being virtual. The technical interviews is one of the ways that companies assess your technical capabilities and your fit for the role. And the better that you do on your interview, the more likely you are to land the job. This is among a bunch of other factors, but the interview is one of these factors. Practicing is the best way to ace your interview. There's no like going around that really. But technical interviews are especially hard, and there are a couple of types that are a little bit less known, and sometimes they can catch you off guard. Our job here today is to make sure that you're confident and you get that job. We'll also be using this workshop as a little bit of a kickoff for WCS Career Services. All right, so we're going to start off doing algorithmic interviews, and these are the questions that ask, how do I think about problems? So Darcy, you want to take it from here?
Sure. So as far as what are algorithmic interviews, the goal is for them to get, is for like the interviewer to get an idea of how you think and how you solve problems. So some classic questions that you might see here might be recursive problems, divide and conquer problems, using data structures efficiently, or graph problems. It's the kind of stuff that you would probably see on like LeetCode and HackerRank most often, I feel like. And some of the things that you might expect will be that it's not going to be super easy questions in these interviews. So that's something to kind of prepare for. There's like different tiers of difficulty. And then it'll also give you an example input and an example output, and you'll try to program the function or whatever to behave in that way. They also may cover some edge cases and like the expectations, or they might not cover all of them. And then the goal is kind of also to go for the fastest runtime, and you also want to make sure that you give a runtime analysis when you're done. So kind of saying how efficient your algorithm is.
So here's an example question of something that you would expect on an algorithmic interview. And this is a super easy level question strictly for the purposes of the demonstration, because we cannot get into anything that's like extremely hard in the time that we have here. So the job is to find the sum of the negative numbers in the array. So you're given an example input. It's the array -1, 3, 5, 7, -9. And then we have an output that is -10. And Darcy and I will walk through this question actually a little bit later, but think about how you would solve this problem and think about how you would explain it to someone. So what do I do? So there's a couple of steps that we recommend for what you want to do as you're doing these kinds of algorithmic interviews. So if it's in person, and by in person, I don't mean like face-to-face because COVID, but I mean like on a video call, for example, always restate the question back. I don't care if it's an easy question. I don't care if it's just telling you return 1 + 1. Clarify the question because it's entirely possible that you misunderstood. Also, it shows that you are a very attentive listener. You're showing the person that you were listening along the way, and you were able to understand what they were telling you. That's actually a really good soft skill to have. Also, think about the type of approach that you're going to use for this problem. So this may be like an iterative solution. This might be a recursive solution. If we're getting a little bit more complicated, is this a graph problem? What do you want to model this as a graph? What do you want to do like DP on this problem, et cetera, et cetera. And also think about any necessary data structures that you have. For example, if this problem intuitively sounds like it should be using like a stack or a queue, maybe that's what you need to be using. Next step is also to think about edge cases. Maybe there are like weird inputs that would make certain programs maybe run incorrectly. And so you want to make sure that yours is doing that correctly. So the next piece of advice is a little bit more controversial. I've seen a couple of people say, no, this is not necessarily the way to go. But what a lot of people have told me, at least, and what has worked for me is always to go for the brute force solution first. Don't worry about runtime yet. Just make sure that your solution works. If it's in person, make sure that you're analyzing the correctness of your code by running your input through your code line by line. And what I mean by this is sometimes if you're doing it on like Codility or whatever, they'll give you like a set of test cases that you can run, or you can compile your code. But I would not recommend doing that first, because taking your solution and walking through it step by step is a really fantastic way of showing that you actually understand the code that you've written. And when Darcy and I do that practice question in a bit, I'll make sure I talk you through a little bit of what I mean by that. If you're using an automatic grading system, so for HackerRanks, code signals, and things like that, which you might get a little bit more of when you're doing virtual recruiting, Run the test cases early and often. So make sure like your code compiles as expected. If it's not meant to compile, then you really can't check for that. But if it was meant to compile as code, make sure that it does compile. Last thing you always want to do if you're in person doing an in-person interview is analyze the runtime. And this goes a little bit back towards the use the brute force solution first. So you analyze the runtime and you realize like, oh, this is like 2 to the n but it could actually be like n squared runtime instead, right? That's a huge optimization you can do. And you want to talk your interviewer through like how you can optimize it. If you have the time, you will optimize it. But most importantly, you need to analyze the runtime. However, one like very small caveat with the brute force solution first is like if the brute force solution is stupid and you can already come up with a way to do it faster in that moment, then start doing that immediately. You do not need to force yourself to do the brute force solution first. But if you really can't think of anything, like if you feel like there's like a clever recursive trick, but you can't think of it right now, start working on the brute force first, and then you might come across a recursive trick along the way. If time permits, try to optimize that. And if your interview is in person, talk the interviewer through every single step of the process. The more that you talk to them, the more likely they are able to give you prompts to be able to help you. And that is super, super, super important. A person cannot help you if they don't know what to help you with. If they don't know what you're thinking, if they don't know what you're doing, then they can't help you. All right, so let's go into systems design interviews. So this is talking about how do I make a robust and functional system?
Yeah, so system design interviews, the goal for the interviewer is to get an idea of your high-level design choices and skills. So classical questions here might be for you to build a URL shortener. They might ask you to build a miniature Twitter, or Facebook, or Instagram, and what kind of decisions you would make there. Or maybe they would ask how you might go about building a search engine. So you can expect to make high-level choices about about the full tech stack and design. So it's not going to be as like nitty gritty, but it's going to be kind of a high level overview of the different elements that your system needs. So you'll also want to be able to defend your decisions. They might ask, why did you choose this over that? Is there a better way that you could do this? And you have to explain your reasoning behind why you chose that. And also you might want to know the company's products. You're definitely going to want to know the company's products because it's probably going to be relevant to the interview. Like if you're at Google, they might be more likely to ask you about a search engine or something, but also don't suggest using like Amazon Web Services at a Microsoft interview or like MySQL at a MongoDB interview, because that's like direct competitors. So probably don't want to do that. And the more often that you can like mention like the tools that you're familiar with, the better.
So just keep in mind, like for these systems designs interviews, you never need to be writing code. You may need to be writing code a little bit later on, and we'll go into that later. But for this part of the thing, this is completely like talking through it. I've also done this interview on a Google Doc before, and it's been really interesting. So let's talk through an example question. So how do I build a URL shortener? So a couple of the questions that they may ask you along the way to prompt you along the URL shortening process is, first of all, how do you store the long URLs mapped to a short URL? What kind of database design do you want to go for? How do you generate the short URL to begin with? Like what kind of, do you want to use like hashing? Do you want to use vanity URLs, et cetera, et cetera? How do you take in the user's input and how are you interfacing with the front end? How do you give the shortened URL back to the user after you've shortened it? So again, like how are you interfacing between your front end and your back end? For example, are you using like a REST API or something like that? How will you manage deleting old URLs? So managing like the space, like it'll grow in terms of space as your product gets used. And also like, how do you know if the system is working? Are you going to build a dashboard? Are you going to keep an eye on the database, etc.? And with all these questions, they're really, really hard. I know I was definitely scared of answering these types of questions for the first couple of years. Like, okay, I've only been in college like 2.5 years, but they were pretty scary for at least 1.5. So the big thing is don't be afraid to say that you don't know something. Or you can say that your best guess is blank, or you would ask someone for help, or you would Google for help. Like, If you try and like fudge a solution out, people are actually going to like that less because it shows that you don't know how to ask for help. Knowing how to ask for help is a very, very important soft skill to have in industry. Being able, as an intern, for example, to go to your manager, go to your mentor and be like, hey, I have no clue how to do this. I have researched this, this, and this, but I don't know how to piece it all together. That's like a big thing that they're looking for with these questions. All right, so what do I do? For those of y'all who were at our behavioral interview workshop, you'll know about the STAR method. So this is situation, task, action, and result. So you want to follow this template in order to give your answer to each of the sub-questions that they'll present you. So again, restate the question. It's always really important to make sure that you're understanding the question, especially when things are online, like there's maybe a lot of static or like somebody's microphone might cut out or there might be noise in the background. So it's really important to make sure that you understand the question fully. And again, showing listening comprehension, always a good thing to do. Determine what your high level goal is. So what do you want to actually solve and what is the best way to solve it? Outline your different steps or the parallel actions that you're going to take in order to solve this goal. And also justify any decisions that you make. So what I mean by this, like, for example, maybe I'll say like for my URL shortener, I want to use like some sort of SQL database to store my long URL, which is my key, to my short URL, which is my value, which actually makes absolutely no sense. You should probably reverse the two. You should have the hash that maps to a long URL. Yes, you should definitely do that. So you want to justify your decision in that, well, people will be entering the short URL. So you want to take the short URL and be able to map it to the long URL. And so that's just an example of like one of the steps and one of the decisions that you'll need to justify. Clearly, I messed up the first time, but like if you're able to recover yourself, that's totally okay. Also, identify any strengths and weaknesses of your system. Like, for example, if you design a system that like would not be able to handle more than one person like trying to shorten a URL at the same time, you need to identify that. It's not a bad thing to have a weakness in your system because remember, this is a 50-minute interview. Like, this is not going to be perfect. But if you're able to identify these vulnerabilities and weaknesses, it shows them that you would be able to iterate this on the solution when you actually get to the job. Also, always give the end results of your decision. So showing that like using a SQL database would give you, or using like a relational database would give you a better, just makes more logical sense than like a NoSQL database. Then you want to tell them that. And lastly, like if they ask you any follow-up questions about your design, just answer them. And as always, like build off of your previous answers and use any previous experiences you had. I know like one of my most successful system design interviews, I basically leveraged something that I witnessed at my last internship and I like told them about like, oh, maybe like we should be building some sort of dashboard to monitor the health of the system. And like that was apparently very impressive. All right, so let's go into the programming and API interview. So this is, you've already designed your system, right? So how do I put it into practice?
Right. So when you're being interviewed with a programming interview, the goal for the interviewer is to get an idea of your pure, as in non-algorithmic coding skills. And often the question is going to be relevant to your job. So the format of it would be to build off of a disguised version of, oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. You'd want to build off of a systems design question, or it might be kind of a disguised version of a systems design question. Also, you'll be using some kind of specific technology, for example, like an API. And also, you'll be focusing on kind of object-oriented programming and class design. So you'll usually be able to reference documentation since you're working with a specific technology. You also may be expected to write test cases or match those provided. And also you want to be able to write clean and well-documented code. A template may be provided, but you just want to make sure that what you write is legible and understandable. Since it's like a non-algorithmic skill, like that's what they're testing for. You just want to make sure that like the structure of what you're doing is pretty good.
So an example question. So let's just say that you're the gym leader of the exploration gym and you specialize in normal type Copenom. This is because like Pokemon strike mattered. But anyway, so you have caught every single normal type Copenon that exists in the Granger, Geese, and LAS regions. You need to write yourself a utility that helps you pick 6 Copenom for the battle based on the metrics that you're inputted. So for an example call for your utility is maybe you would want to query for copenome that have an HP greater than 150, a level greater than 25, speed less than 30, and then special def exactly 50. So how would you design this, right? Like how would you write the code for that? And you would probably have designed this system in a previous step of the interview, or they may have given you like a couple of tips on how to do it, and you would just have to implement that in code. And I don't think I mentioned it specifically, but you would be provided like a copenome API that you can call, and you need to be able to understand how to call the API and how to be able to use it. So what do I do? Again, as always, restate the question. Cannot emphasize this enough, but you guys get the drill now. Understand the problem that you're trying to solve. And then before you start writing any code, this is something you should always be doing in your assignments anyway, but before you start writing your code, design your system, whether that's on paper or whether that's just like talking it out or whether that's writing it in comments. Know how you're solving the system before you go into it. Then write clean and modularized code. Use multiple files if you need to, as long as they don't tell you that you can't. Design classes, use inheritance, use the skills that you're learning in your classes or will be learning in your classes to be able to write code that nobody will get angry at. Remember that usually it's a software engineer who will be reading your code at the end of the day. So you don't want to make it a painful process for them, because if you make it painful for them, they might not hire you. Also, cleanly document your functions and your methods as you go. I know sometimes like I like to write all my documentation at the end, but when you're in a crunch time, you may forget about like what you did previously or may not be able to describe it as well after the fact rather than in the moment. So you always want to write good documentation. If there's any provided tests, you want to use those tests. And if not, you should definitely write your own. But even if they give you tests, maybe it's really cool to be able to write your own edge case tests or something like that. That's only if it's feasible and only if you have the time. And again, keep in mind that a suite at the company will most likely be the person looking at your code. So make it legible and make it not painful. And make it very evident that you tested for edge cases. All right, Darcy?
All right, so if you're looking for some more resources for practicing for algorithmic interviews, some of the good sites that you could practice on are LeetCode, HackerRank, and CodeSignal. There's also class resources from CS 225 and 374 that have like some good data structure kind of questions or algorithmic kind of questions. And for systems design interviews, Free Code Camp and Geeks for Geeks have good questions there, and also class resources from 126 and 242. Also, if you're interviewing for a specific role like iOS or Android or machine learning, you want to create projects in those languages and frameworks so that you're better like equipped to deal with those kinds of questions. So like if you are interviewing for an iOS role, but you haven't made any kind of project in iOS, it doesn't have to be big, but definitely getting some experience there would be helpful in interviewing and on the job. Also, you'll probably want to practice API usage. It's kind of like that might be a more advanced kind of question, but you can like Google around for fun APIs to use and to kind of get a feel for how any APIs are really used. Also, buddy interviews are a great resource. That's something that I did when I was preparing for interviews. Basically, you find someone, it can be in this workshop, or we can help you find someone who's looking to prepare for interviews, and you can kind of just do like an interview or interviewee role and go back and forth and talk about what went well or what could be like worked on. And also Google is your friend. So we went over some sites here that had good resources, but there's a lot else out there too.
Yeah, about the buddy interview thing, Darcy and I actually met by doing a buddy interview. So you might be able to meet your next co-chair by doing a buddy interview for a company. Yeah, that was completely coincidental. But on top of that, do you still need more practice? Totally get it. That's totally normal. So come and check out WCS Career Services. So we're actually closed for the semester, but they'll be available again starting in January. You'll get a chance to sign up for a one-on-one session with a WCS officer to do a resume review or a technical interview. Behavioral interviews will be starting off in the spring. I don't know when in the spring, but they will be. And if you're interested, we have an interest form here, WCS Spring Career Services, the tiny URL there. And we'll be using that form to contact you at the beginning of the next semester to see if you want to get a career service thing. So what's really important to know about these, though, is that the officers who run these take a lot of time to make sure that they're specialized and individualized for you. We literally like have a 1 week turnaround or a 2 week turnaround on these interviews because we want to prepare the questions that are exactly right for your skill level and maybe something that you're going to get from a company that you're interviewing for. So this is a great chance to get personalized and curated interview practice. However, if you're looking for a resume review, we still offer those this semester, and they're drop-in. So if you come to WCS office hours, which is at that link there, sometime between Monday and Thursday from 2 to 4 p.m., you can come and chat with an officer and get your resume reviewed. The one stipulation is that you do need to have an actual resume before we can review it. We can't like help you piece it together. And if you're looking for some more familiar faces, like I know Darcy and I have office hours on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. All right, I